We're now going to begin part 2 of the lectures on Islam, looking at the requirements and sociological elements. Islam is mainly a religion of practices, not just beliefs. The question of Muslims' life is not what do you believe, but what have they done to show their obedience to the will of Allah. So even though they might have beliefs, they literally show their beliefs by their actions. And even if they don't believe everything that you think they ought to believe, as long as they're doing the right actions, they're going to be fine. The primary practice of Islam is found in the requirements of the 5 pillars that every Muslim must do to submit to the will of Allah. The pillars are shahada, confession, salat, prayer, zakat, almsgiving, psalm, fasting, and the hajj, better known as the pilgrimage. So the first pillar is confession. To be a Muslim, a person must make this confession, which is pictured in Arabic above, that sums up the most fundamental belief on which all of Islam is based. To make this confession sincerely is to become Muslim. So the confession is translated into English, which once again, I can say it in English, and even if I say it sincerely, I still haven't said the confession. But there is no God but God, no God but Allah. And so they say there is no God but God, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the apostle of God, or Muhammad is his prophet. These are all translations, so it doesn't really matter exactly how I say it. There is no God but God is their statement of strict monotheism, and it's crucial to all of their other beliefs. The second part of the statement, Muhammad is God's apostle, is a statement of agreement that Muhammad is God's spokesman, that his teachings are true. Making this confession does not guarantee salvation in any way. This is not like a prayer of salvation, but it is a statement that is the necessary first step on the road to salvation. Now, some of the teachings about their final judgment day say there may be some righteous people who never made this confession who may be brought in because it's the will of Allah. But generally, if you haven't made this confession, you're not following the will of Allah. So that confession is the first pillar and the first necessary statement. The second pillar of Islam is prayer. All Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day at appointed times and locations. As you can see, they normally meet for prayer in a mosque, and the prayer times take place at these 5 times. At sunrise, and literally it says, when you are able to distinguish a white thread from a black one. That's when sunrise is measured. At noon, at mid-afternoon, at sunset, and 1 hour after sunset are the 5 times of prayer. And so that's the times that the call to prayer would come. Now, not everyone is expected to go to the mosque at every hour of prayer, because there's sometimes it's unlikely that you can get there. But I was in Turkey one time, and the call to prayer came out over the loudspeakers, and people who were operating their little shops, they disappeared around a little barrier, and they went and they knelt down on their prayer mats, and they went through their prayers, and then they came back out 5 minutes later or something and continued doing business. So it is best to go into a mosque, but it's not an absolute requirement each and every time. The prayers are very formalized and ritualistic, with memorized quotations and a specific series of physical positions, standing, kneeling, prostrating, kneeling, directed by the leader's call of Allah, and then you move to the next position, and then you move to the next position, and you start out with, I hear you, I'm here before you, I'm kneeling before you, all this type of stuff. The first surah, which is that first passage of scripture from the Quran, is the opening is usually prayed first, followed by a series of other prescribed recitations, normally whispered in an undertone. So we're not talking about a time of prayer, we're talking about doing prayers, reciting prayers, but it's required to do this 5 times per day. Women are usually expected to pray in their homes, and it's considered wrong for women and men to pray in the same room. Now, in many mosques, there will be a separate room for the women, and they would be allowed to go there, but it's not really acceptable for women and men to be in the same room praying. The third pillar is almsgiving. Almsgiving, all Muslims are required by the Quran to practice regular charity. Now, Quran didn't set regular patterns or amounts. Muslim law kind of gave a standardized annual giving that a Muslim must perform for the poor. Now, the amount is not a lot. Basically, you assess your incomes and holdings, and you're actually expected to give around 1/40th of that amount each year. So it's not a huge amount, but it's still a contribution, and it actually formed an early system of welfare that in Islamic countries that existed before it existed in the West. So this almsgiving is a part of what it is to be Muslim. The fourth pillar is fasting, and the fast is specifically during the holy month of Ramadan. Ramadan is considered, they thought to be when Muhammad had his first revelations. Muslims believe that the gates of paradise are open and the gates of hell closed during Ramadan. Therefore, the ones who keep this fast and keep it right, they can be forgiven of all their pardonable sins. Now, that doesn't mean all their sins, but the pardonable sins. And basically, the gates of heaven, the gates of paradise are open, and the blessings of Allah are able to reach the people, and their prayers are able to reach the people during that time period. Because Muslims use the lunar calendar, you probably have noticed this if you've paid attention to your calendar at all. The month of Ramadan moves throughout the solar year. I mean, there's times when it's in May, there's times when it's in July, there's times when it's in September. So Ramadan it's not just at one time a year. It's not on November 18th or something like that. The fast is relatively easy to keep when it falls in the cooler winter months, but it's very difficult when it falls in the heat of the summer because Muslims are not allowed to eat or drink anything. You can't even drink water from sunup to sundown. So sunup to sundown. Now, you're supposed to abstain from eating, drinking, sexual activity, even tobacco. You're not supposed to do anything from sunup to sundown. Now, they spend the evening every night partying and eating and drinking, everything else like that. But during the sunup to sundown hours, you're required to not eat or drink. And I had a friend who was from this area, and they talked about how they hated Ramadan because during the summer months, your mouth would get so dry. And as a matter of fact, the religious police could stop you and have you open your mouth looking for that white coating that formed inside your mouth to see whether you had been drinking that day or not, to see if you've been keeping the fast or not. So it's a really challenging thing depending on what time of year. We had students who've been in Egypt during this time, and they actually went to this celebration of Eid al-Fitr that's at the end of Ramadan. It's a celebration that the time of fasting is over and the time of feasting has returned. But this is a requirement. This is not an option. Like I said, we're talking about these 5 pillars. These are not optional things. The 5th pillar is called the Hajj, or the pilgrimage. Every Muslim adult is required to make a pilgrimage to Mecca once during his lifetime if he is free, sane, healthy, and can financially provide for a journey. Now, understand they will put back money for years and years and years to be able to do this. And as a matter of fact, it is parents who have money set aside money for their children's Hajj. Children who have money, who have older parents who didn't have money, will set aside money for their mother or their grandmother or their grandfather to make the Hajj. So this is a big deal because, again, this is not I can kind of do it if I want to. This is one of the 5 requirements to be pleasing to Allah. This is just a picture, and I'm always amazed at this picture when you look and understand that every one of those tiny little white dots there is a person. And they're all moving toward, in a big circular fashion, they're moving toward the Kaaba in the very middle there. And I've done a lot of research on it, that there's a very intricate, it's a 6 to 7 day process that they go through. And it's very interesting, all the steps of it, but it's hard to overestimate the emotional impact of a Muslim finally setting foot inside the city that he has prayed toward all his life. To stand there in the Muhammad city with 2 million, this is about 2 million people in this picture of his fellow Muslims, brings forth a powerful feeling of mission and solidarity. So the Hajj is a powerful communal event. And as a matter of fact, you see there why one of the things that they do as soon as they arrive, before you go into the city and go into the city center, you take off the clothing you've been wearing, and every person wears the same white clothing, the same white head covering. Every person dresses the same. So there's nobody rich, there's nobody poor. Everyone is in the same clothing. So it is an incredible communal activity that they take part in. But as I said, these are not 5 suggestions. These are 5 requirements. And if you don't do these 5 things, you are not Muslim. These are the 5 things you must do to be in obedience to the will of Allah. Other requirements of Islam that are considered normative are found either in the hadiths or in Sharia law. There are 2 primary categories of this. There are things that are haram. Haram are things that are strictly prohibited. And there are things that are halal, actions that are permissible. There are many actions that are haram. They're strictly forbidden. Now, chief among these would be any idolatry in any form. Muslims do not allow any sort of images or statues to appear in their homes or their worship places. This is, once again, that's interesting because I've shown you, if you're a real student already of know about Islam, I've shown you several pictures that are somewhat unusual, because what those pictures are is of drawings, paintings, or works done with tile that included the Prophet Muhammad in them. Up until a certain point, I'd have to guess, but I think it was the 1700s, there was no problem with showing an image of the Prophet Muhammad. As a matter of fact, many of the huge mosques would have images of the Prophet Muhammad receiving, and that's what you were seeing, the Prophet Muhammad receiving the revelation from the angel. Then one year they decided that showing the face of the person of Muhammad was haram. And so if you looked carefully at those pictures, you could see that even though the picture is still there, they've whited out his face or put a covering over his face so his face would not appear. And it's done in the name of avoiding any sort of idolatry. They do not want people worshiping an image of Muhammad, and so they do everything they can. So that's haram. There are also many foods that are considered haram. Anything that includes pork products and anything that's alcoholic would be haram. We were flying one time in Europe, and my wife ended up seated next to a Muslim man. If I'd have known he was a Muslim man, I had her trade places with me because that's very awkward. But we were flying out of Latvia, and Latvia eats mostly pig. I mean, pig is what we eat. Pig and chicken is about the only thing you get there, but mostly pig. And they served the meal, and they didn't really have any options. And they brought the meal by and put it down. And he opened up the box, and he says, "What is this? What is this?" He said to her in English, and she said, "I think it's pork." He literally took his fork and flipped it off of his plate onto her plate. It'd be like if you saw a roach on your plate. Yeah, get that off there. And it literally was disgusting to him because it's considered haram. And he's never eaten pork, and to eat pork would be like you eating puppy. It's disgusting to him. So haram things are considered strictly forbidden. There's a concept of halal. Those are the things that are permitted. As a matter of fact, in certain parts of the United States, you will see places that are called halal restaurants. There's one in Arlington, there's one in mid-cities in Dallas. Halal restaurants. That means that this restaurant only cooks foods that Muslims could eat. That there's no food in there that a Muslim couldn't eat, and there's never been any pork prepared in that restaurant before. So it's all halal. And so it's a listing of the acceptable foods and drinks, and along with the halal has to do with the dress codes and modesty and dress for men and women. And though the Quran does not require women to be completely covered, they have to dress in such a way that it does not draw attention to their beauty. Now, there are many countries where the purdah is required, is the traditional form of women's dress, and it's been enforced on women in the more strict countries, strict Muslim countries. And it covers, as you can see, it covers a woman from head to toe. The only thing that you can see is the woman's eyes. but there's no part of the body, not even a piece of hair that is shown. As a matter of fact, when it's done properly, even the eyebrows wouldn't be seen. So there are very strict versions of Muslim dress, but they're enforced in different places. When I was in Turkey back in the mid 2000s, 2007, 8, 9, there were a lot of Muslim women who they would just have their head covering. They'd be wearing jeans and a shirt. If I understand correctly, Turkey has become much more Islamic conservative since then, and so a woman would not dress that way. Now, they don't have to dress like this. They might have to dress more like this, but it depends on what country you're in as to how severe the coverings are for women. The culture, Islam, ummah is the word that Muslims use for community, ummah. And Islam is a religion of community. To be Muslim is to take part in the life, traditions, and rituals of the Islamic community. So they are incredibly community-oriented, community-focused. To be Muslim is to be a part of the Muslim community. There really is no concept of a personal faith or a personal relationship with God. I mean, we talk about our personal faith, our personal relationship with Jesus Christ, all this kind of stuff. They don't have a personal faith. Their faith is tied to the faith of their community of faith. All of their practices are done in conjunction with the community. They don't go into a closet and pray alone. Now, they might have an individual time of prayer because they can't get away from work or whatever else, but they are praying at that moment in time because that's the moment that everybody else who's Muslim is praying. So even if they're alone maybe they're at an airport, they're alone, but they're praying because that's the moment when all Muslims are praying. So even though they're going to be judged as individuals, the religion is always communal. And it's a very important thing to understand that their whole existence is tied up in the community. Now, just real quickly, just go over just a few more details. There are two primary groups within Islam that have existed almost since the very beginning. They're known as the Sunni and the Shiite. These two movements formed soon after the death of Muhammad, and it was based on arguments concerning who should be the next caliphate, the successor to Muhammad. It is thought that Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, had been designated as caliph, but not everybody liked Ali. And so majority of the leaders there chose Abu Bakr to be the caliph. Well, the Arabic word for consensus is Sunni, and so this is the Sunni party. It's the majority party, and it's the ones who voted for Abu Bakr to be their caliphate, to be their caliph. The Arabic word for minority is Shia, and thus you have the followers of Ali who form the Shiite party. So literally, I mean, Muhammad dies and they have a church split that quickly. So now, the crazy thing about it is, this picture I just showed you back here, I don't know who is Shia and who's Sunni, and neither do they in that picture, because they're all wearing the same head covering, and they all do the same things. However, in the real world of things, you have nations that are the Shia majority, you have nations that are Sunni majority. They don't get along with each other. They've even had wars against each other and such. And so even though there is this huge community, there is still this disagreement between them. And their disagreements even come out in some of their theology concerning their ideas of who should be the current leaders and what the end of time might look like. Throughout Islamic history, there have been men called imams. Shia Muslims believe that there is a special line of succession from their early leaders. So they followed Ali, and they continue to follow all these other people. And each of the successors is called the imam, and he's said to possess supernatural knowledge and prophetic leadership. So once again, the Shia people tend to follow a prophetic leader who is right now considered their imam. Today, imam refers also to a spiritual and political leader of the Shiites, and the imam's interpretation of the Quran is considered infallible. Now, there have been many disagreements, schisms that have occurred in Islam over the question of how many imams there have been and what is the line of succession. There are some groups that say there have been 12 imams, some say 7, some say 5. Some believe that there will be a 12th Imam that will come about, but each of these groups share a belief that there will be a return of the last true Imam. Now, whether it's going to be the 5th Imam or the 7th Imam or the 12th Imam, they say that he will return as the Mahdi, and his return will bring about the universal Islamic rule. So they have this idea that Allah's will is that Islam rules the whole planet, and when this great Mahdi appears, Islamic rule will be over the entire world. For now, the Imams rule with the help of ayatollahs and mullahs who serve under them. Again, I've just touched on this stuff. There's so much more that we could go into here. If you want to dig into it and research it, if you want to look at Islam through the lens of the Imams, that'd be a very interesting study to do. So feel free to do that. In spite of the differences and schisms that may appear within Islam, there is one great truth that holds them together. The words of the Shahada, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his apostle or his prophet. These are the first words that a Muslim baby hears, whispered in the ear after he is born. It literally, just as soon as the baby takes a breath, someone whispers those words in his ear. These are the last words a Muslim hears as he lies dying. The people who are around him will whisper that in his ear as he lies dying. So we have to be aware of the fact that Islam is a religion and a society and a way of life. It's not just a religion. It's not just a set of beliefs. It is a society. It is a way of life. It is a community. And we need to be aware of that when we're dealing with Islam in our everyday lives.